Hi, this is Dr. Richter back with part 3 from Philosophy Goes to the Movies. Rationalism and empiricism. So far, we have seen how both Plato and Descartes seek to call into question the idea that our experiences gives us knowledge of the world. Plato suggests that our experience only gives us shadows removed from reality. Descartes, that everything we could experience could be a dream or the fabrication of some evil demon. But this raises the question, how do we attain knowledge of the world as it really is? The cinema goer can always leave the cinema, escape from its illusions, and emerge into the real world. All of this takes place within the realm of our ordinary experience. And even within the cinema, in cinematic portrayals of radical illusion and deception like The Matrix, the real world that the hero escapes into is still a world that can be experienced, a world that remains in important respects familiar to us. But for Plato and Descartes, it is the realm of ordinary experience in general that is being called into question, which is being characterized as, in some sense, an illusion removed from reality. So how are we to make the radical kind of escape that Plato and Descartes think is required to attain knowledge? How can we go beyond the world of ordinary experience in order to comprehend the world as it really is? The answer that both Plato and Descartes give is that the senses are not our only source of knowledge. We also have reason, intelligence, or understanding, which, once we set aside the distractions of sensory experience, we can use to see with. It is a kind of inner perception or insight. Our senses tell us only about shadows or appearances. The intellect allows us to comprehend the true world underlying those appearances. In this, Plato and Descartes represent a distinctive kind of understanding of knowledge, often called the rationalist approach. This approach typically downplays the role of the senses in the acquisition of knowledge. For rationalists, the senses only give us access to a world of shifting appearances, whereas knowledge has to do with what is unchanging and eternal. Moreover, the senses are too prone to error, illusion, and deception to provide reliable information, whereas knowledge has to be certain. For the rationalists, it is our reason or intellect alone that can give us genuine knowledge, knowledge of the world as it really is, the world underlying mere shifting appearances. Only through our reason can we attain knowledge that is certain and cannot be called into question. We can sum up the rationalist position as the idea that by employing certain procedures of reason alone, we can attain at least some important truths about the world. Plato's cave image embodies his version of the rationalist conception of knowledge. For Plato, we are like the prisoners in the cave to the extent that we rely on sense experience, taking for reality what are merely shifting appearances, distant copies or shadows of reality. Through philosophical training, we will be able to escape from our chains, to break away from reliance on sense experience, and learn to use our reason alone. The ascent from the cave stands for the upward journey, whereby we come to use our reason alone to comprehend the true nature of things. On Plato's account, the use of reason amounts to a process of recollection, in which we gain knowledge by recalling information that is already present in our minds, acquired prior to birth, but which we have forgotten. And in recalling this information, we come to comprehend the true nature of things, which Plato identifies with what he calls the forms. The forms are the timeless, unchanging essence of things, existing entirely beyond the world of experience. The objects we encounter in our ordinary experience are only imperfect copies, mere shadows, distant echoes of these perfect forms. For example, the various different chairs we encounter in our ordinary experience are all imperfect copies of an ideal, timeless, unchanging chair, the Platonic form of the chair existing beyond our experience. In a similar spirit, Descartes, through his skeptical arguments, seeks to wean us away from our ordinary dependence on our senses, to encourage us to start making use of our reason or understanding. His Meditations as a whole is a kind of journey through which we turn away from our senses, learn to use our reason alone, and come to comprehend the true nature of reality. We quickly find that although we can doubt everything our senses tell us, there is one thing our reason tells us that we cannot doubt, namely our own existence, because no matter how deceived I might be, even if I am deceived by a supremely powerful evil demon, I still have to exist in order to be deceived. Hence Descartes' famous claim, I think, therefore I am. That is true even if I am within a matrix program, a lucid dream, or in some other context of complete illusion. And it is through our reason or understanding alone, what Descartes calls the light of reason, that we are able to establish, on the basis of this first truth, a secure edifice of knowledge concerning ourselves and the world. As the meditations progresses, Descartes establishes not only that he exists, but that he exists as a thinking thing, a mind. By inspecting and working with the ideas he finds within himself, he is then able to demonstrate to his satisfaction that God exists. Finally, he is able to establish knowledge of the external world on the grounds that God, being a good God, is not the kind of being who would wickedly deceive him, which guarantees that the general ideas Descartes has about the nature of the world do in fact correspond to reality. Once again, our reason allows us to comprehend the true nature of reality, and once again, it is a very different world than that revealed by the senses, a world that can only be described in terms of the general ideas we have about the nature of the world, which are mathematical and geometrical in character. It is possible, of course, to criticize these rationalist pictures in their details. For example, Descartes thinks that thanks to a benevolent God, he can establish knowledge of a wider world, and knowledge of what in general this world is like. But not many have found his arguments for the existence of God convincing. And if there is no God to bridge the gap, then we seem to be left with a whole new level of skepticism, a new kind of uncertainty. The issue, simply stated, is as follows. If all we have direct access to are the ideas in our minds, how can we ever be sure that there is a world external to ourselves? The possibility of this kind of uncertainty is used to great comic effect in John Carpenter's Dark Star, which features a band of bored astronauts on a mission to destroy unstable planets that could menace intergalactic colonists. Here, astronaut Doolittle tries to convince one of the intelligent talking bombs not to explode by convincing it that while it can certainly be sure of its own existence, bomb, I think, therefore I am, Doolittle, that's good, it cannot be sure of anything else. The astronaut argues that because all the bomb is really aware of is the electrical impulses in its computer brain, it has no way of knowing what the external world is like, or even if there is any external world at all. As a result, it cannot be sure that it has received a genuine command from outside to explode. In an ingenious stratagem, but even if it succeeds in preventing the bomb from exploding, and only temporarily as it turns out, we are still left with the problem of how to escape from the Cartesian self and regain knowledge of the external world. Such criticisms have to do with the internal details of these rationalist accounts, but there are also those who have criticized the rationalist approach to knowledge as such. Skeptics have suggested that what rationalist philosophers like Plato and Descartes have offered as absolutely certain knowledge of a world beyond ordinary experience is really nothing more than ungrounded speculations on their part, merely personal fantasies dressed up as knowledge. And by presenting their accounts of the world as having been arrived at by some mysterious rational process, they have rendered their positions dogmatic and unverifiable. What is perhaps most problematic for the rationalist position is that almost every view of the real world that has been asserted as absolutely true by one rationalist has been disputed by other rationalists, equally certain of the truth of their own accounts. Partly in reaction to the rationalist approach, we find another influential approach to knowledge and philosophical thinking, known as the empiricist approach. For the empiricist, claims to attain knowledge without reference to sense experience lead inevitably to dogmatic and unverifiable claims about what the world is really like. The empiricist position is that we get our knowledge primarily through the senses, through sense experience and observation. In other words, the empiricists call into question the rationalists' faith in the power of human reason and their downplaying of sense experience. For empiricism, it is reason that plays the secondary role. Reason by itself, independently of experience, cannot establish any truths about the world. At best, our reason can determine that certain things are true by definition, such as all bachelors are unmarried. But this kind of statement does not tell us anything about the world. It only tells us about the meaning of the words we are using. For the empiricists, the only way to gain knowledge of the world is to go out and actually observe things. All knowledge of the world, they argue, is derived from sense experience and observation. Empiricists tend to dismiss rationalist claims about a world beyond that which we can experience as no more than baseless speculation. They acknowledge the rationalist argument that the sort of knowledge we can acquire on the basis of the senses cannot be absolutely certain, that it is at best merely probable. But they also hold that the rationalist demand for absolute certainty is excessive and unrealistic. It is enough that we are reasonably certain, and we can attain a reasonable degree of certainty to the extent that our claims to knowledge are firmly grounded in sense experience and observation. Two important advocates of the empiricist way of thinking are the British philosophers John Locke and David Hume, who came onto the scene shortly after Descartes. In part, they were reacting against Descartes' rationalism, but they also were seeking to formulate a conception of how we acquire knowledge that was more in keeping with the methods of the new natural sciences. The modern natural sciences emerged during the 16th and 17th centuries with figures like Francis Bacon, Galileo, and Isaac Newton in the forefront. Descartes himself aimed to provide a philosophical foundation for these new sciences, grounding scientific knowledge in the first principles established by reason alone, but he came to be seen as giving insufficient weight to the role of experience. What characterized the new natural scientific approach, according to its advocates, was a reliance on empirical methods, on observation and experiment, as the proper avenue for the acquisition of knowledge. It is the kind of approach we see in The Name of the Rose, in which the monk William of Baskerville, Sean Connery, investigates a series of murders in a 14th century monastery. In emphasizing the importance of the experience of the senses and on systematically formulating and testing likely explanations to the light of that experience, Baskerville looks forward to the empirical methods of the modern scientific outlook. This scientific method seemed to be triumphantly confirmed by the success of Isaac Newton towards the end of the 17th century. Newton's comprehensive physics, in which he formulated a number of simple physical laws capable of explaining phenomenon as varied as the tides, the fall of an apple, and the movement of planets, represented a decisive vindication of the new natural sciences. Thus, the British empiricists, by making experience and observation central to the acquisition of knowledge, were in effect giving a philosophical formulation of the new scientific method. Is seeing believing? Empiricism sounds like a much more sensible, down-to-earth way of thinking about knowledge than the rationalist approach. We no longer have to rely on some mysterious rational capacity that discerns ultimate truths about the world independently of ordinary experience. We do not need to depart from ordinary experience in order to gain knowledge of the world. Our knowledge is derived from ordinary experience and observation. However, despite its attractions, problems have been raised in connection with this approach as well. One of the most important problems concerns the notion of ordinary experience itself. The empiricist approach puts a great deal of weight on experience, since it is out of experience that knowledge is said to arise. Experience itself is held to be basic, uncontroversial, and unproblematic. How can there be any question as to what it is that we directly experience? What we experience is simply given to us, and we can appeal to this to ground and justify our beliefs about the world. At least, so goes the empiricist view. Of course, we sometimes experience illusions, dreams, or hallucinations, and there what we experience misleads us about what is the case. But under normal circumstances, i.e. most of the time, experience can be relied on. It provides a solid foundation, a good ground for our beliefs about the world. However, the question to be asked is whether there is ever a straightforward foundation of this sort. It has been argued by a number of commentators that there is no basic experience prior to knowledge that we can appeal to. In other words, it is never simply a matter of seeing as believing. Rather, what we experience is always subject to interpretation or judgment of some sort, in the light of some framework of beliefs. And if this is so, the argument runs, we can no longer say that knowledge straightforwardly arises out of experience, because what we know, what we believe, influences what it is that we see in the first place. It certainly seems true that seeing is a more complex process than one might at first think. We are not simply passive recipients of our experience. It is possible, for example, to misperceive something, to think that one sees, let us say, the cat curled up in the corner, when in fact it turns out, on closer examination, to be nothing more than a rolled up scarf. And this sort of misperceiving would not be possible unless interpretation played a role in what we were perceiving, i.e., unless what we thought we saw, the cat, was in fact a perception that was being interpreted in a certain way, in line with our beliefs and expectations. The question then arises as to whether there are nonetheless some perceptions that speak directly to us without interpretation, that show themselves to be what they are without any possibility of error. Or do all perceptions have to be interpreted in some way in light of our beliefs? The empiricist would say that there are basic perceptions given to us as raw data, which unmistakably show what they are. This is the view of Locke and Hume, along with more recent representatives of the empiricist tradition like Bertrand Russell, who called these basic perceptions sense data. On this view, there would still be a pure perceptual experience and a clear distinction between what is directly given to us in perception and our interpretation of it. But how plausible is this distinction? For example, it seems rather artificial to say that we really see various movements or changes in shape and then go on to interpret what is happening as a smile or a wave of greeting. Don't we simply see a smile or a greeting? Ambiguous pictures also pose a problem for the empiricist notion of pure experience, since they suggest that normal observers can view the same thing under the same circumstances and yet have very different visual experiences. What a number of critics of empiricism have argued is that we can never separate out what we really literally experience from our interpretation of it. The only thing that we have direct and immediate contact with is our experiences, and these experiences vary with the knowledge and expectations of the observer. So on this view, every act of perception involves interpretation. What we perceive is always theory-dependent or theory-laden, inescapably shaped or colored by what we know. Consequently, we cannot say with the empiricist that knowledge arises straightforwardly out of experience. The issue of theory dependence arises in a very clear way in connection with the cinema. Cinema is primarily a visual medium, showing rather than telling its stories, but this does not mean that it simply presents a story to us in a visual way. How we see what is presented to us is profoundly shaped and manipulated by the filmmaker. Film does not merely record events, but guides us as to how to see them. As George Wilson argues, filmmakers aim most fundamentally to make an envisioned significance visible to the audience, to bring it about that the viewer sees things in a certain way. For example, the director may wish to bring it about that the viewer sees a series of events as causally connected, a character's behavior as manifesting certain states of mind, or the lives of characters as ordered by chance or social forces. The question then arises as to what is being given to us in perception here, and what we read into what we see. Advocates of theory dependence would argue that it is artificial to suppose in the empiricist manner that there is a basic experience which we then go to interpret, and that it is in fact probably impossible to draw any strict boundary between perception and interpretation. What is clear is that a great deal goes into shaping how we see events in a film, including the way the action is edited, how scenes are framed and composed, the camera angles and movements employed, and the sound effects and background music. This means that for filmgoers to be able to see what is going on in a film, they have to bring with them knowledge of the various techniques and conventions of film narrative, along with more general beliefs about the nature and operation of the world outside the cinema. Thus, as Perkins puts it, quote, "If we could rid ourselves of knowledge and our customary patterns of thought, we could not make sense of a movie," end quote. Given that the experience of watching a film raises various questions about what the audience actually sees, it is not surprising that some films have directly addressed this issue. One film where the question of what exactly we see comes up in a central way is Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. Here, L.B. Jeffries, James Stewart, wheelchair-bound with a broken leg, also a wheelchair user, just to point out the ableist rhetoric there, passes the time by watching the neighbors in his apartment block. His position is like that of the watching cinema outside, for he too is an immobilized spectator, watching unseen in the shadows, isolated from the action he is witnessing. And since the film is shot almost entirely from his point of view, we quickly become voyeurs along with him. In almost all that follows, we see what he sees. With him, we become acquainted with the characters who inhabit the block, the aspiring composer, the enticing blonde, Miss Lonely Hearts, the newlyweds, and Thorwald, the traveling salesman across the way with the bedridden wife. Then the bedridden woman disappears one night, and Stuart becomes convinced that what he has witnessed is a murder. But has he? What exactly has he seen? His housekeeper, his girlfriend, and his detective friend all offer various theories about what has happened. New information comes to light. A postcard arrives for Thorwald, apparently from his wife, recuperating in the country, which calls the murder story into question and suggests a more innocuous way of interpreting what has been seen. Further observations provide grounds for renewed suspicion. When an overly inquisitive dog is found dead, Thorwald is the only person in the block who does not come out onto the balcony to see what the fuss is about. It gradually becomes clear that Jeffries is right and that there has indeed been foul play, but it is not the case that what he has seen across the way straightforwardly allows him to decide the matter. Rather, it is only through the interplay between what is perceived and its interpretation in terms of other observations and beliefs that he is able to finally determine what he has seen in the first place. In Hitchcock's film, dramatic tension is built up because of the uncertainty about just what it is that Jeffries and we in the audience watching along with him have witnessed. It is not that we cannot see things happening, but that we have to interpret what we see to make sense of it. Moreover, there does not seem to be anything in what we see that is being given directly or unproblematically to us without a need for interpretation. Hitchcock keeps us off balance by ensuring that crucial scenes are ambiguous, able to be seen in a number of ways. Are the butcher knife and small saw that Thorwald is wrapping up over the sink merely household implements or murder weapons? Is the trunk that he ties up with heavy rope in the bedroom a piece of luggage or a coffin for his wife? Nothing in what we are experiencing here allows us to establish which of these alternatives is true in each case, because what we see depends crucially on our beliefs about what is going on. This uncertainty is heightened because so much of the film's running time is devoted to looking. As one commentator has noted, over a third of the film is in fact silent, without dialogue, as we look along with Jeffries at his neighbors, an exercise in what Hitchcock called pure cinema. So we look intently, and yet we are often not sure what it is that we are seeing. Hitchcock refuses until close to the end of the film to provide either Jeffries or us with any definitive guidance as to how to interpret what we have seen. Deprived of this guidance for the most part, we become aware of the extent to which interpretation and judgment play a role in what we see in the cinema, the extent to which cinematic seeing is an achievement guided by the filmmaker. In this way, the film also bears out the more general idea that what we see is not simply given to us, that we are actively involved in shaping our perception. A similar meditation on what it is that we actually see can be found in Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, 1966. The film's unnamed central character, a photographer, finds that a series of photographs he has taken of a man and a woman in a London park seems to have recorded a murder. In one photo, the woman appears to be looking at something. Another shot is duly blown up to reveal what seems to be a gun peeking out of the bushes, and a further enlargement appears to show the man's corpse. So here what we are seeing as being enhanced is the photos are enlarged, but at the same time these enlargements, far from bringing us closer to reality, offer increasingly abstract and meaningless images. They only come to appear meaningful when Hemmings puts the photos together to form a narrative, to tell a story, and thereby imposes an interpretation on them. In this way, a question is once again raised over what it is that we see, and the importance of interpretation in perception is highlighted, this time in connection with photographic images. What is brought into question is the idea that photos never lie, that what they present is given to us directly and unproblematically. Instead, it is suggested it is necessary to interpret what we see, to put a construction on it in terms of some narrative, and that if we cannot do that, the images presented to us will not make any sense. With this, Antonioni is also able to allude in an indirect way to the role of the filmmaker in shaping how audiences interpret what they see. Like Hemmings, the filmmaker puts together a series of photos in order to construct a narrative that makes sense of what the photos show. And like Rear Window, Blow Up bears out the more general idea that what we see is not given directly or unproblematically to us, but requires interpretation on our part. The role of interpretation and judgment in determining what we see is exploited in another way in a number of other films, where the audience is tricked by the filmmaker into making perceptual judgments that they later have to call into question. In Fritz Lang's You Only Live Once, circumstances cause the ex-con Eddie Taylor, Henry Fonda, to be put on trial for bank robbery. As Wilson notes, this film repeatedly raises questions about sight and the failure to see. At several points, the audience is led into making a mistaken perceptual judgment, after which a wider context is revealed and the judgment is shown to be wrong. For example, a newspaper in close-up suggests Eddie has been found innocent. We see the headline, Taylor freed. Then the camera pulls back to reveal that it is only one of 3 possible front pages. The others say deadlocked and guilty, that have been prepared prior to the outcome of his trial. By making us reconsider what we think we know in this way, Lang can put a more general question mark over whether Eddie is indeed innocent or guilty of the robbery, and warn against any easy answer to this by reference to what we can see before us. Indeed, on close inspection, the facts as they are presented to us in the film, including the way the robbery itself is portrayed, do not resolve the issue one way or the other. Similarly, in Cabaret, set in 30s Berlin, an angelic-looking boy in a sunny beer garden sings what sounds like a traditional German song, Tomorrow Belongs to Me, until the camera pulls back to reveal his Hitler Youth uniform. The lyrics take on a sinister significance, and as those around him join in, the song becomes a disturbing popular anthem. What initially seems to be innocent and captivating thus becomes something quite different once the larger context is revealed and the true nature of what we are seeing becomes apparent. Here the film alludes to the rising Nazism that provides the larger context for the lives of the film's characters, a context that becomes increasingly visible as the film proceeds. Cinema could not achieve these effects, tricking the audience into misperceiving, if we were not actively involved in constructing the meaning of what we see. Kant and Relativism. If we accept the idea that our experience is unavoidably interpreted in some way, shaped by our background beliefs, then it seems that we cannot accept the basic empiricist position that knowledge is straightforwardly derived from experience. But if so, then how are we to understand knowledge? One possible response might be to move away from empiricism and accept that we have an active role to play in the production of knowledge. This is the kind of answer that is in fact provided by the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. His work can be seen as a response not only to the British empiricists, particularly Hume, but also to rationalists like Plato and Descartes. Kant accepted the basic empiricist doctrine that all our knowledge begins with experience, that experience is necessary for knowledge, but he rejected the empiricist one-sided emphasis on the contribution of experience alone. It does not follow that it all arises out of experience. Experience by itself is not sufficient to give us knowledge. So what is missing from the empiricist picture? For Kant, it is the contribution of the mind, of reason. Rationalists like Plato and Descartes emphasized this element, of course, but they held that reason alone, independently of the senses, could somehow provide us with knowledge of the world. On Kant's view, rationalism and empiricism are equally one-sided. Knowledge requires both reason and experience, both rationalistic and empiricist elements. Kant's position, as formulated in the Critique of Pure Reason, is roughly as follows. By itself, sense experience is a meaningless, unintelligible confusion of sensations. We only acquire knowledge when we bring order and intelligibility to our experience, when we actively impose ourselves upon it. We do so by ordering or interpreting our experience in terms of certain organizing principles, certain frameworks of thinking that we have within ourselves. This ordering activity is the work of our minds, of our reason or thought. Kant called these organizing principles the categories, and he claimed to have identified 12 of them, including, for example, the categories of substance, causality, and reciprocity. So, according to Kant, the reason why the world we experience appears to us as a world of things or substances interacting with one another and obeying laws of cause and effect is that we always interpret our experience in terms of the principles or categories of substance, reciprocity, and causality. These rational principles are, as it were, the spectacles through which we see the world. We do not create the world that we see, but we cannot see the world except through the spectacles of the mind's organizing categories. In general, then, for Kant, the world we know is the world as it appears to us through the framework of our organizing categories. This view, it is worth noting, also means that we can never know the world as it is in itself, but only in terms of the categories through which we interpret it. Thus, in Kant's view, although experience is necessary for knowledge, since it is the raw material, experience alone is not enough. In order to attain knowledge, this raw material has to be worked on, organized, interpreted, given a form by our reason or thought. This is a view that acknowledges the contribution we ourselves make to knowledge, the role of our own activity in forming our understanding of the world. In other words, for Kant, we do not simply discover what the world is like. Our view of reality is something that we construct, something we actively organize, in accordance with a framework of categories or principles. However, Kant does not think that this account makes knowledge merely subjective, i.e., relative to the principles of interpretation employed by particular individuals. This is because he does not think that different people organize their experiences in different ways. Rather, he argues that all human beings, all rational beings, possess the same basic ordering principles and, consequently, that each of us orders our experiences in the same way. In other words, he holds that there are universal, fundamental forms of human experience. In so doing, he seeks to preserve the idea that knowledge is something that is held in common by people, something that we can all, in principle, agree on. Nonetheless, if we reject the idea that we all impose the same categories on our experience, it is not a far step from Kant's view to a radically relativistic kind of account in which different people organize their experience in different ways and thus have different but equally legitimate ways of understanding the world. Here, the Kantian idea that we order and shape the world that we know becomes the idea that since experience is not an independent basis for knowledge, since knowledge involves judgment, it can vary with different frameworks of thinking. And indeed, this has been one development in the theory of knowledge since Kant. It has been argued by a number of people that how we interpret or understand reality depends on the frameworks of thinking, the perspectives we bring to bear. These perspectives have been variously understood as worldviews, conceptual frameworks, forms of knowledge, or sets of beliefs, guiding interests and expectations. And the further claim has been made that because these frameworks, forms of knowledge, or guiding interests differ amongst different individuals, groups, or cultures, these people or cultures have fundamentally different but equally legitimate ways of viewing or understanding the world. Thus, we have the idea of cognitive relativism, the idea that knowledge, what can be said to be true, varies relative to individual, social, or cultural conditions. We saw earlier how films can raise questions about what it is that the audience actually sees, because the filmmaker is typically concerned to get the audience to see what is going on in a certain way, and that films like Hitchcock's Rear Window explicitly explore the role of interpretation in determining what we see. For the same reason, we can also find films that explore the possibility of there being different but equally valid interpretations of the same events from different points of view. One of the classic examples is Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, 1941. At the death of newspaper magnate Charles Foster Kane, a reporter is sent to find the real truth about Kane. Those he interviewed, including his best friend and his ex-wife Susan, offer differing accounts of Kane's life, which are presented to us through flashback. For his best friend, he's corrupted by egotism. For his ex-wife, who he tried to turn into an opera star, he is solely concerned with getting his own way. But these are not the lying flashbacks of the usual suspects. They present us with different Kane's life as viewed from different perspectives. When their stories overlap, we view the same event from a different perspective. Thus, in Leland's account of events, Susan's disastrous operatic debut, portrayed from the point of view of the audience where he is sitting, appears as farce. In Susan's own recollections, the event, now portrayed from the stage, becomes painful and humiliating. The overall effect of this multiple narration device is that the reporter fails in his task. Who Kane really is remains elusive because he never appears outside of some perspective or other. Indeed, the film calls into question the very possibility of presenting truth objectively. A more recent film that explores the idea that our perceptions are conditioned by the perspective we bring to bear is He Said, She Said. Here, point of view has become an explicit theme. Two journalists, Dan and Lori, are given their own TV show, in which they give their opposing views on various issues. As they get to know each other and become romantically involved, the events in their own relationship are presented twice from each of their perspectives, once again through flashbacks. For example, what he sees as a romantic first date, she perceives as an awkward accidental encounter. Their different versions of event reflect their different standpoints, male and female, politically conservative and politically liberal, and so on. Similarly, Hilary and Jackie tells the story of Hilary Dupree and her famous cellist sister, Jacqueline, from each of their perspectives. These two are both musicians, but while Jackie shines on the world stage, Hilary marries, has children, and settles in the country. And as their lives diverge, we are given two versions of the events. The film is distinctive in that it does not resort to the flashback device to portray the two different versions of events, but simply presents Hilary's story and then restarts the narrative to present Jackie's. Here, the device of presenting the same event in two different ways, such as Hilary's announcement to Jackie that she is getting married, serves to highlight the differences in their lives, personality, and outlook. Overall, Citizen Kane, He Said, She Said, and Hilary and Jackie serve to indicate ways in which experience can be colored by our outlook, and more broadly, they serve to raise the question of whether there can ever be direct access to reality, outside of our particular perspective of what is going on in the world. Two other films that are often cited as illustrating a relativist position are Kurosawa's Rashomon, 1955, and Sidney Lumet's 12 Angry Men, 1957. However, as we will see, this view can in fact be disputed. Rashomon tells the story of the rape of a nobleman's bride by a bandit and the nobleman's murder from four perspectives: that of the bandit, the bride, the nobleman who speaks through a medium, and an eyewitness, a woodcutter who happens to be passing. Each telling of what happened is significantly different. In the bandit's version, he is heroic. The woman consents to his advances, and afterwards she insists he and the husband fight to the death so that she will be spared disgrace. In the bride's version, she is a victim. The bandit runs off afterwards, and she inadvertently kills her unsympathetic husband. In the husband's version, he is the victim. His bride wants to run off with the bandit, and when the bandit refuses her request to kill him, he kills himself out of shame. Finally, in the woodcutter's version, the husband no longer respects the wife, who angrily goads the two men into fighting, and the husband is killed. It might seem that here the same events are being interpreted in quite different ways, once again suggesting that experience is conditioned by the perspective we are coming from. However, there are large differences in the stories that cannot quite be explained in terms of the differing perspectives. In particular, each of the three main characters, the bandit, the wife, and the husband, name themselves as the husband's murderer. As Jarvie points out, a closer reading of the film suggests that Kurosawa does not want to illustrate the relative character of knowledge, but rather is taking a cynical view of the ability of human beings to twist the truth in order to preserve the idea that they have of themselves. The bandit, the bride, and the nobleman all present highly self-serving accounts of what went on, in which they each appear in the best possible light. It later turns out that even the woodcutter, who might be thought to be the only objective witness, has reason to lie about what happened, since it turns out that he has stolen something, the wife's dagger, from the scene. His story comes across as a compilation of elements from the first three stories. Kurosawa himself has gone on record to say that his film is about self-deception, our capacity to delude ourselves rather than about relativism. Thus, Rashomon does not call the idea of objective truth into question, only the reliability of people's testimonies. In this respect, it has a lot in common with the documentary The Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, 1988, where we are once again presented with conflicting stories about a crime, the murder of a police officer, for which the wrong man was convicted and later exonerated. In the documentary, a number of eyewitnesses, the shot officer's colleague under pressure to help secure a conviction, the eyewitness who fancies herself a detective, the man who later turns out to have been the real killer, all present their versions of what happened. Once again, what comes into question is not the possibility of objective truth, but rather the reliability of the testimonies and recollections of those involved. Like Rashomon, 12 Angry Men is sometimes cited in connection with relativism. Here, Henry Fonda plays Juror 8, the architect, the only person on a jury holding out for a not guilty verdict for a young man accused of murder. Through argument, he gradually brings the others around to his point of view. The other jurors bring various perspectives to bear on the issue. For example, Juror 10, the bigot, whose whole assessment of the case is colored by his view that these people are just born bad, and Juror 3, the angry man whose views are affected by his estrangement from his own son. This film might accordingly be seen as an illustration of the way in which people's beliefs and interests color their attempts to reconstruct events from a mass of testimony, and thus to imply that the way we understand the world is always colored by our beliefs and interests. However, as Jarvie once again points out, the film is probably more accurately seen as one man's heroic stand for the truth, in the face of others whose views are clouded and distorted by interest and prejudice. Fonda is the quiet voice of reason, the only juror who remains calm and reasonable throughout the proceedings. Through his conscientious devotion to the truth, he is able to see past the prejudices of others and identify the clues that make it impossible for the young man to be convicted. The truth and nothing but. There are two ways of thinking about what is going on in 12 Angry Men. You may want to argue that it is falling back into a naive and indefensible notion of unconditioned truth. Since all accounts of the world are conditioned, at least to some degree, by the personal, social, and historical circumstances of the knower, any view that pretends to be unconditioned is simply concealing the perspective from which it is coming. Alternatively, the film can be seen as demonstrating the power of truth over views that are clouded by prejudice. Here we have a reassertion of the idea of knowledge, of what can be said to be true, as something that is not affected or conditioned by the particular circumstances of the knower, by their pre-existing beliefs, interests, or prejudices. This is a view that brings us back to Plato. Plato is one of the earliest and strongest advocates of this robust conception of knowledge. Generally speaking, both the rationalists and the empiricists thought that such knowledge was possible, and in each case their theories of knowledge provided a method for attaining it. For the rationalists, knowledge was to be gained through rational insight, and for the empiricists, by grounding knowledge in basic experiences. For both, any pre-existing beliefs, interests, or prejudices we might have could only serve to interfere with the search for truth, and the approaches they proposed for acquiring the truth were intended to free us from their influence. Even Kant, who argued that we needed to bring a pre-existing framework to bear on our experience in order to acquire knowledge, insisted, as we have seen, that the forms of order we imposed on our experience were universal and independent of our particular interests and circumstances. This strong view of truth stands in direct opposition to the idea that there is no such thing as unconditioned knowledge, that our understanding of the world is always conditioned in some way by our particular interests and circumstances. For advocates of the strong notion of truth, such views undermine the very possibility of acquiring knowledge and threaten us with cognitive disaster. In addition, it has been argued that abandoning this strong idea of truth will lead to moral and political problems as well. To see how this might come about, we can once again refer back to Plato. As we saw earlier, Plato's account does not only have to do with knowledge, but also with a certain kind of liberation that can be achieved through knowledge. The truth, it seems, will set you free. Others can control and manipulate us by filling our heads with lies, illusion, and distortion, but by seeing through these illusions and grasping the truth of our circumstances, we can free ourselves from this control. Traditionally, lies, illusion, and distortion are seen as going hand in hand with moral and social corruption, serving the interests of powerful individuals and groups in society and concealing their activities from critical scrutiny. The bright light of truth, which sees through the lies and reveals the underlying interests they serve, promises to rob evil of its power over us. However, a view that stresses the located character of knowledge seems to undermine this possibility. If there is no such thing as a truth, unconditioned by circumstances, if all knowledge, in fact, serves the requirements and interests of particular individuals or groups, we seem to have lost any standpoint from which to mount such a challenge. We have already seen in 12 Angry Men a defense of truth as an antidote to views that are clouded, corrupted, and distorted by prejudice or interest. In this film, truth has a clear moral dimension. As the advocate of truth, Henry Fonda's juror is a morally heroic figure fighting the prejudiced views of the other jurors, prejudices that threaten to bring about a miscarriage of justice. The quintessential cinematic searcher after truth, however, is the detective or private investigator, and here also the moral dimension of truth is usually evident. The detective is traditionally pitted against the evil that hides beneath deception and subterfuge, the evil that cannot bear the light and must hide itself in dark spaces. Uncovering the truth robs evil of its power and allows the rule of morality and justice to be restored. Even in the moody, pessimistic classics of American's 40s film noir, The Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep, where society is riddled with corruption and the private investigator himself is often less than pure, the truth that is eventually uncovered still defeats evil and helps bring some justice to the corrupt society. Yet, even if we accept the view that we can have insight into the world that is unconditioned by our circumstances, we may still want to question the idea that this truth has the power to vanquish evil. Certainly, the traditional faith in truth's power to defeat evil has been called into question in some of the more recent detective films. In The Name of the Rose, this skepticism is projected into the past. The film's Sherlock Holmes-like hero, William of Baskerville, investigating the murders in the medieval monastery, must penetrate the dogma, superstition, and fear of the monks, and even contend with the blind fanaticism of the Inquisitor, in order to eventually reveal the truth behind the murders. Far from being inspired by the devil, as the monks and the Inquisitor insist, the crimes have a much more human cause. They are, it turns out, the result of attempts to conceal a long-lost work by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, a volume held in the monastery's labyrinthine library. On the face of it, this is a triumph of truth and enlightened reason over fanaticism and superstition. Yet, although William solves the mystery and reveals the truth, very little is achieved as a result. The monastery, along with the book, is destroyed by fire. The Inquisitor rides off undefeated, and dogma and superstition continue to hold sway. An even darker and more pessimistic vision is presented in Polanski's Chinatown, 1974, a film that revives film noir themes but with a significant twist. Here, Jack Nicholson, an LA private eye, takes on the seemingly routine investigation of an errant husband, but soon finds himself confronted with a network of monstrous power and corruption presided over by the wicked Noah Cross, John Huston. Yet the result of his investigation is not the restoration of morality and justice. Even after uncovering the truth about what is going on, JJ is powerless to do anything at all about it. The woman he tries to protect from Cross is killed. Cross himself escapes scot-free, and monstrous evil triumphs. This absolute failure on the detective's part is more than just a reversal of the standard private eye plot. It is also a reversal of our traditional faith that revealing the truth will defeat evil. The victory of evil over truth is pretty much complete in David Fincher's Seven, 1995. In this film, the two detectives, David Mills and William Somerset, played by Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, not only solve the mystery behind a series of murders based on the 7 deadly sins, but even manage to take the killer, John Doe, Kevin Spacey, into custody. Yet, far from being defeated, the killer has engineered his arrest, and he is still able to carry out one final murder, his own meticulously planned killing at the hands of one of the detectives. So these recent detective films embody a more cynical view of truth's power to oppose moral and social evil. At the very least, they serve to remind us that the forces of truth do not always triumph over corruption, and that even when brought into plain view, evil can continue to flourish. And there remains the more fundamental question as to whether we can ever in fact speak of an unconditioned, absolute notion of truth at all, or whether our understanding of the world is always limited and conditioned in some way by our particular interests or social circumstances. The debate between advocates of an absolute notion of truth and those who see truth as conditioned by our circumstances continues in philosophy. It is time for us, however, to turn our attention to other areas of philosophical concern. In this chapter, we have looked at a number of ways in which knowledge has been understood by philosophers. In discussing the role of knowledge in various forms of liberation, We have also moved beyond the issue of knowledge proper and touched on considerations relevant to moral thinking and to social political philosophy. We will return to these wider moral, social, and political concerns in chapters 3, 4, and 5. In the next chapter, however, we're going to start closer to home and look at philosophical accounts of ourselves, of the self, or human nature. Thank y'all. I'll see you next time.